Guryong Village is a South Korean shantytown that's literally right across the street from the glamorous Gangnam District. It's one of the starkest contrasts between rich and poor in the developed world, and stands out as an anomaly of most neighborhoods of its kind. Guryong Village is frequently called the last slum in Seoul, mostly because of how it came to be. The land Guryong Village eventually developed on had been occupied since at least 1925, though mostly as a rural setting. Sandwiched between a pair of mountains, it's known to be especially hot in the summer and equally cold in the winter. Guryong Village is the culmination of half a century of aggressive development after the Korean War, which had devastated the country. In the mid-50s, the South Korean government wanted to modernize their country over all else. But rapidly moving from a simple farming economy to something much more high-tech couldn't come without a forceful hand. And the man leading that charge was one General Park Chunghee, the controversial president of South Korea. Taking office in the early 1960s, General Park enjoyed popularity amongst the people despite his harsh tactics because of his noticeable benefit to the economy. For the first time, South Koreans were enjoying the same standards of living as their Western counterparts. But by the early 70s, the boom of South Korea's economy was slowing to a trickle, for which General Park took major heat from the citizenry. His reaction was to institute martial law to get things back on track, creating a dictatorship he promised would be ultimately for the benefit of the people. Some of his actions, of course, proved otherwise, but his rush to gentrify major cities at the expense of the most vulnerable wasn't widely known to the average Joe in Korea at the time. The success of Korea's so-called tiger economy landed international praise, no doubt amplifying pride in an already nationalistic setting. And General Park doubled down on his efforts by declaring the need to, quote, purify the streets of vagrancy in 1975. This involved a brutal crackdown on anybody deemed unsavory to the image of Seoul. Those considered vagrants were often the most helpless in South Korean society, like disabled persons, alcoholics, the homeless, and even lost children. Police were supported by shopkeepers who grew tired of seeing the less fortunate outside their businesses. Many were placed in internment camps across the country. General Park's government chose to bolster urban development efforts by putting detainees to work building new infrastructure. Laborers were kept under strict curfews, expected to do their part to clean up the capital without being too conspicuous to the wealthy. Though General Park was assassinated in 1979, subsequent governments also held on to prioritizing economic growth above all else, and continued these policies concerning those in poverty. Just 2 years after the general was killed, South Korea surprised the world by winning its bid to host the 1988 Summer Olympics. This was a major point of pride for a country which a few decades earlier was considered quite underdeveloped, and one of the first opportunities to show the planet just how far South Korea had come. With all eyes on South Korea, the government increased its squelching of vagrancy into the mid-80s. More shantytowns were broken up in favor of expensive condominiums, with over 16,000 people put into work camps by 1986. Detained laborers weren't paid for their hard work, and most endured horrible treatment from their overseers. One work camp, the Brothers' Home, was notorious for the purported violence carried out by its administration. A former detainee compared conditions there to that of North Korean labor camps, and deaths reportedly happened daily. Attempts at blowing the whistle on the Brothers' Home began in 1987, but were stymied by government officials, fearing it would draw negative attention to South Korea just a year before it hosted the Olympics. Still, the camp was quietly shut down and the land redeveloped not long after. By the time the Olympics had rolled around, upwards of 720,000 people had already been displaced. Redevelopment priced most people out of their old neighborhoods, and they were now forced to find other, less conventional accommodations. As displaced residents became refugees in their own city, they turned a mostly undeveloped section of private land into a new shantytown, bordering on the up-and-coming Gangnam District. The area had been a mixture of green space and farmland since 1977. There were already a few ancient homes and some recently built greenhouses for farmers by 1986. As the Olympics drew closer, more and more of the impoverished found their way to Guryong Village and began setting up makeshift shacks with whatever they could find. The influx of people put even more strain on the already ill-equipped utilities of this undeveloped land. During the cold winters, most people burnt coal briquettes for warmth, as there were no running gas lines. Since most shanties were constructed of cardboard, plastic, plywood, and other refuse, they were extremely flammable. The area was also prone to flooding because of poor drainage and sewer access. Still, as development in South Korea showed no sign of slowing down, shantytowns like Guryong Village were more often becoming the last refuge of the destitute. Other slums on the outskirts of Seoul were progressively destroyed to make room for more suburbs, and the displaced would usually congregate at Guryong Village. Despite its shabby conditions, a distinct community was beginning to emerge amongst the aging population, many of whom had worked their entire lives only to be forced out of their homes because of encroaching development projects. Electricity was first brought to Guryong around 1992, and a water supply around 1998. Some residents chose Guryong Village specifically in case there was future development they may enjoy the benefits of. And of course, there were many opportunities for entry-level employment in the nearby Gangnam District. Yet, for all the money in Gangnam, over 2/3 of the residents were paid paltry salaries which barely covered the most basic expenses of living in Guryong. The shacks occupied by residents were, put generously, modest constructs of between 16 and 99 square feet. Cockroaches and other bug infestations were common. Because this was unceded land, most shacks were considered illegal, yet this didn't stop them from being valued up to $47,000. The few with registered addresses were the most senior members of the community who had family ties to the land. Newcomers were usually older people with nowhere else to go, often because they had no family. Many households didn't even have working toilets, with bathrooms being communal to a cluster of shacks. There was, however, a strong sense of fraternity in the older days. Residents usually got together after work to share food and other spoils of their labors. As for security, groups of 8 men would patrol the neighborhood overnight. All of this community spirit would be challenged, though, by the arrival of newcomers with very different intentions. Rumors that Guryong Village would be developed as impressively as Gangnam District were common through the 1990s. Residents remained hopeful they'd see a return on the struggles they endured in these living conditions, either for themselves or for their children. But as Guryong Village became more widely known throughout South Korea, many residents developed an aversion to media attention. One man had this to say to reporters, quote, "Outsiders including journalists and people like you have ruined our life. A couple divorced because their daughter's face was in the media but without concealing her identity. She became entirely isolated from her classmates. I was also a victim of the media's insensitive treatment that I found my name in the newspaper. My social relationships were entirely ruined by this. Some treat us like swindlers whose aim is only to make money." This reaction was understandable given what this newfound attention was doing to Guryong Village. As questions of redevelopment lingered into the new millennium, a trend was emerging of speculators taking up residence in Guryong Village so they'd have dibs on any government compensation offered to the squatters. Though the Villagers Association began issuing a limited number of residency cards to discourage newcomers, these wound up being sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Usually speculators made deals with the original squatters to gain access to the dilapidated shacks, creating a confusing scenario of investors living amongst the impoverished to profiteer off their circumstances. Some would outfit their temporary homes with security features or even satellite television. Naturally, there was some resentment developing towards those seen as playing poor to get richer. Interestingly enough, Guryong Village doesn't seem to have ever had any problems with rampant alcoholism or narcotics. Likely because by 2005, up to 70% of its population was over the age of 70. Since the shantytown lacked legal recognition for so long, it's always been difficult to pin down the exact number of people living in Guryong, but it's estimated to be between 2,000 and 4,000. Being outside the bureaucracy also means that very few residents are eligible for government assistance, with just 6% getting any sort of help in 2005. Instead, charities and church organizations have had to pick up the slack in assisting the least fortunate. Other residents sometimes step up to help out one another, like a woman who gave free haircuts to her elderly neighbors. There was even a community service center that helped manage the unique issues of living in Guryong, albeit with few resources at hand. Guryong Village's many shortcomings had become impossible to ignore by the 2010s. The poor integrity of the buildings caused at least 11 major fires between 2009 and 2014. Dozens were displaced from the little shelter they had, and at least one death was reported. These incidents put more pressure on local governments to act, but bureaucracy continued standing in the way of any tangible change. The plan as of 2011 was to buy up the land and rent it back to the denizens at controlled rates. The main conflict came down to differences in how the Seoul municipal government and Gangnam's district office wanted to approach this redevelopment. The SMG prioritized the needs of residents, whereas the district office was concerned about how the landowners would be compensated. Changes in city management usually meant changes to the planning, further slowing down the process. At the head of this conflict were yeon-hee of the Gangnam District office and Seoul Mayor Park Won-soo. Shin made it very clear that she favored corporate development, and as such the people of Guryong Village became cynical to her claims of working in the public's interest. By 2013, Seoul's city management was ready to move ahead with the plans regardless of the district office's cooperation. Still, speed bumps in the plan continued through 2014. Residents lost faith that work would ever get done, and the divide between city and district was beginning to trickle down into the community. Some thought that the more recent fires were the product of arson, possibly at the hands of disgruntled land speculators pushed out of the community. A deadline for redevelopment was given. The two sides would have to come to an agreement by August 3, 2014. Nevertheless, there was no inkling that either party would concede to the other's demands. One resident had only this to say, quote, "We are really sick and tired of the dispute. Now we're not sure whether the plan is really for us. It seems that officials cling to the issue for their own political gain." This frustration was compounded by a grim reality. Many of the elderly residents were dying of old age. Able-bodied community leaders painted crosses on the boarded-up homes of the deceased to draw attention to local politicians. But still, the redevelopment process dragged on. With few young people wanting to move into Guryong Village, the local economy of convenience stores and such took a financial hit. Some were optimistic in spite of feeling forgotten. Quote, "Even though we live in these huts, we are very happy. We have each other's company. We must make our own happiness." In 2016, Seoul City Planning Committee finally approved a cohesive plan for development. It then took another 2 years until local government was getting ready for building, projecting to finish by 2020. The plan was to compensate the landowners while giving the impoverished residents first shot at new public housing to be built. The usual conflicts continued brewing, and the legality of Guryong's shacks still hung over the heads of developers. Even for all its faults, Guryong had still been the home of most residents for decades by now, giving them an emotional attachment which only further complicated their feelings towards development. Many residents demanded compensation as they would have nothing left should the teardown go ahead, but this of course clashed with their status as illegal tenants. This made it increasingly likely that once again, the redevelopment of Guryong would miss another deadline. Sure enough, plans were held up once again when Shin yeon-hee was arrested on charges of corruption. Amongst other things, she was accused of twisting the arm of businessmen to hire family members, and frequently deflected from her faults by accusing political rivals of being communists. Many Guryong residents weren't bothered by her detainment, as they felt Shin was vindictive towards the community whenever they criticized or questioned her motives. Ultimately, though, this wound up causing even more delays to the project. As of December 2020, there are still residents in Guryong Village that, despite their industriousness, continue to rely on the goodwill of others to survive. The world health crisis has hindered the redevelopment process, but it's impossible to know if things would have gone any differently otherwise. Guryong Village encapsulates a troubling reality in South Korea. The majority of those in poverty are the elderly. The enduring conditions in this last shantytown of Seoul are a reminder that despite all technological advancement, a society needs to put effort into ensuring the most vulnerable are taken care of, especially when it's aggressive development which helped put them in this position in the first place.